I'm going to start this week with Donald Trump. And it's been announced that his White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, will leave by the end of the year and be replaced by, well, who knows who at the moment. But apparently Trump is consulting his senior advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to decide who should replace Kelly. Jared Kushner, of course, a lifelong friend of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. And it's interesting when you look at Trump's background. You know, it's been my contention all along, which was at odds with quite a large number of people in the alternative media, that Trump is just an owned frontman for forces working through him to impose domestic and foreign policy that suit this shadow cabal. And many in the alternative media, particularly in America, treated Trump like some kind of messiah who was coming along and going to sort it all out because Trump was different. And I found it extraordinarily contradictory and naive when I observed this in the Trump election campaign through to the election in 2016, to see people who had been saying for years that it doesn't matter who you vote for because the same people will be in control, that somehow that all changed with Trump, and Trump was going to be different. And what happened, and this is something that truly streetwise people in the alternative media would have seen through, and some did, but many didn't, because they're not as streetwise as they think they are. And the great the great trap that you can fall into is being told what you want to hear. So there's certain things that people in much of the alternative media in America want to happen in America. And Trump, in his election campaign, was saying he was going to do those. Well, he hasn't, but he said he would do those. Normal thing with politicians, you say what you'll do and then you do something different when you get into office. And this was to do with overseas wars. He was going to pull out of these wars and these basically occupations in the Middle East and Afghanistan. He wasn't going to go on anymore. He wasn't going to get involved in other people's affairs in other people's countries, etc. And he was going to bring jobs back, and he was going to stop outsourcing to the poorest people in the world and all that stuff, which was all nice to hear. But there's a vast difference between what is nice to hear and what is actually going to be done by the person saying it. And where the naivety massively came in was that somehow this man, Donald Trump, was going to buck the system and dictate what was going to happen, instead of, with president after president after president after president, have the agenda dictated to him by those that brought him to power. And of course, when you look at Trump's background, it is blatantly obvious that he's owned. And all this bravado, I will do this, I will do this, I will do the other, is just that, bravado. See, what you have in Trump is, first of all, someone who, by what he said, would have credibility with that great constituency in America that has been ignored by both political parties. They call it in America the middle class. It's different to the way we perceive the middle class in the United Kingdom, but it's a group of people, a large constituency of people who've been ignored and have suffered as a result in terms of economics and other things. Outsourcing was one of the big ways that this constituency has lost its economy in so many ways, lost its job pool. And so he was telling them what they wanted to hear, and he was telling the alternative media in America what they wanted to hear, and they bought it and supported him. And to a very large extent, the alternative media in America was very influential in getting him over the line. And I sat looking on, shaking my head in despair at this naivety. And what is it turns out, if you look at, like I say, Trump's background, is that he's just being dandled on a string. But because he's a bombastic, narcissistic, me personality, he can give the impression with his tweets and all this stuff that he's in control and he's the strong man running it all. He's not. He's a little boy in a situation he doesn't fully understand, or even nearly fully understand. Doesn't understand the way Washington works, doesn't understand any of it. So let's look at this whole situation. What's happened since Trump was elected is appointee after appointee that he decided, at least officially, was going to take various positions in his administration. They've been disappearing and being replaced by other people, sometimes replaced by other people who replace the other people. And what we are seeing is the neoconization of the Trump administration, appointment by replacement by replacement. And of course, the neocons are a group of people who came together under something called the Project the New American Century in the 1990s. And they were central to outlining the countries that they wanted America to regime change in the Middle East, and then pushing through the policy to do it. And I've gone into that in great detail elsewhere. But this neoconization has gone on and on and on, with more people who answer to the neocon mentality, which is basically as far right as you can imagine, so far right it makes itself coming back, and has been pushing this agenda in the Middle East, has an economic agenda too. And this group is dominated by ultra-Zionists who answer to Israel. And so we're waiting for John Kelly's replacement to be announced. But again and again, you'll see neocon people replacing previous appointments. For instance, John Bolton, the National Security Advisor. The neocons have been trying to get him into that position since Trump was elected. And he's gone through others who were either had to be removed through, quote, scandal, or by Trump just sacking them. And along eventually comes the man they wanted all along, John Bolton. This is what I mean by the neoconization of the Trump administration. John Bolton was a member of the Project the New American Century. He is a massive neocon. Every time the word Israel is mentioned, he falls to his knees and bows his head. And he's gone on since he came into office, Bolton, pushing this attack, this demonization of Russia, of China, North Korea, particularly Iran, and he's doing exactly what this neocon Israel-controlled group want him to do. So let's go back to understand how Trump is controlled. Let's go back to 1990-91. Trump is not a great businessman. He might be a great salesman, he might be a great promoter, self-promoter, but he's not a great businessman. He's a front man, he's a face. And in the 1980s, early 1990s, he got himself into serious, staggering levels of financial trouble because he made some catastrophic business decisions with regard to casinos in Atlantic City. He apparently had 2 built and then bought a third, the massive Taj Mahal casino. And as one commentator said at the time to Trump, one observer, that it was a big mistake and that to make it work financially, indeed just to keep going, those casinos would have to generate more than $1 million a day, which they weren't going to do. So the inevitable happened. And by the early 90s, 1990, 91, Trump was $4 billion in debt he couldn't pay, to a total of 72 banks. And those 72 banks were dominated by Zionist and ultra-Zionist interests. 1 billion of that debt was personal debt that he would have to find himself. And so Trump is looking down the barrel of the end of his business career as he goes into bankruptcy. But miraculously, those 72 banks decided they weren't going to pull the plug on him. And not long afterwards, when you compare it with $4 billion of debt, Trump's up and running again. And the guy who oversaw and represented the 72 banks in this bailout of Trump, well, it wasn't a bailout, was it? It was a mega bailout. It was a guy called Alan Pomerantz, a real estate attorney. And he said, we made a decision that he, Trump, was worth more to us alive than dead. And by dead, he meant bankrupt. And so somehow he survived. And Trump, when he got into this desperate financial trouble, approached 2 companies to help to sort out the mega mess. And one of them was Rothschild Inc. And the senior managing director of Rothschild Inc. was a man called Wilbur Ross. And Wilbur Ross was central to saving Trump's business career and his wealth. When Trump was elected to become president, he named Wilbur Ross as his commerce secretary. Someone else involved in sorting out Trump's mess was Carl Icahn, a Zionist billionaire. And when Trump came to the presidency, he named Icahn special advisor to the president on regulatory reform. Of course, regulatory reform is something that if you control it, then you have enormous power, because you are dictating what regulations people have to live by, not least financial people, and those that they don't. And apparently ICANN left over some form of conflict of interest, but you see the pattern. Now, ICANN, by the way, was apparently going to be given the Treasury post, Treasury Secretary post at one point, but eventually it went to another ultra-Zionist, Steve Mnuchin, who's still the Treasury Secretary. Another interesting point is it's reported that in February 2018, ICANN saved himself $31.3 million by selling his holdings that were sensitive to the steel price days before Trump added 25% tariffs on steel imports. But that, of course, would be just a coincidence and nothing to worry about. Now, the person who advised Trump through this attempt to stop bankruptcy was his bankruptcy lawyer. His name was David Friedman. David Friedman, when Trump came to power, was named US ambassador to Israel, an ultra Zionist who oversaw the movement of the American embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, with all its massive implications and symbolism for the future of the Palestinians, because what Israel wants to do is get Palestinians, as many as they can, out of Israel, and certainly out of East Jerusalem, because they want to replace at some point the big mosque in Jerusalem with a rebuilt Solomon's Temple. So they are ethnically cleansing that area so that they can eventually do that. Now, add to this background, and my goodness me, in terms of people that answer Israel in the Trump administration, I mean, we could be here for days, really, going through them. I mean, it's unbelievable. But add to that Trump's biggest funder in his election campaign was an ultra Zionist casino owner and Israel media owner called Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson handed over phenomenal amounts of money, and for that there is a list of things that they want in return. This is how this political funding works. And so one of the things that Adelson wanted was the movement of the embassy. Well, with David Friedman in place, then that could happen, and did. But the big thing that they wanted was an end to the Iran nuclear deal, because on this list by the Project The New American Century of regime changes they wanted the American military to bring about in the Middle East was regime change in Iran. And with the nuclear agreement with America under Obama and European countries, etc., that whole situation with Iran was placated and calmed down, and everything went quiet. But the Israel agenda is for regime change in Iran, as laid out by the Project for the New American Century in its document, infamous document from September 2000, a document that said, by the way, that to justify all these regime changes in the Middle East and to justify the massive increase in the military budget, to make that happen, they basically needed an excuse. and they said that there had to be some kind of massive event, a catastrophic and catalyzing event, as the document put it, like a new Pearl Harbor. And of course, a year after that document was published, and 9 months after the people that wrote it basically came to power with the Bush administration, Bush administration, in 2001, America had what Bush called at the time the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century, 9/11. None of these things are random. None of these things are unconnected. They're all connected. So it had gone quiet with Iran, and that was not good when you want a regime change. So with Sheldon Adelson's money and all this other pressure from people around this neoconized Trump administration, and John Bolton coming in as National Security Advisor, the Iran deal was ditched. And it's all kicked off again now with Iran, with Bolton at the forefront, demonizing them, and sanctions have been imposed against them, because what they do is they impose sanctions. They've done it with Russia, they've done it with China. You impose sanctions, particularly on a country like Iran, and you create economic deprivation. This is an old technique. And with that economic deprivation, externally created, comes the public mood that becomes basically fed up and is looking for something to change it. And at the time that you are creating this economic deprivation through your sanctions, you're also funding, training, and placing people in the country to start the agitation so that you can sell regime change not as an invasion, but as a spontaneous people's revolution. This is what they did in Libya, not least through help, as always, from George Soros's Open Society foundations that specialize in this agitation. And they've tried it in Syria, which without the intervention of Russia would now be just like Libya, controlled by chaos, which is what has happened, of course, in Libya, where it's a catastrophe caused by the UK, US, NATO invasion, and all the manipulation of that society that went on before in preparation for sending the boys in. The same was planned for Syria. They're still trying, but Putin has outmaneuvered them so far. And so these decisions that Trump is making, these policies, are simply basically handed to them. And he is allowed to have his own rhetoric, saying, I want this to happen, I want that to happen, I want the other to happen, so that he can keep talking to his natural constituency, those that got him into power, and saying, I'm standing for what I said I would do. But they just make sure that despite the rhetoric, what he's talking about never happens. Only the neocon agenda happens. And I would, say to people, don't, for goodness sake, listen to what politicians say. Listen to what they say. Put it on the back burner. And then watch what they do. It's what they do that matters, not what they say. What they say is just to get elected. What they do is what changes society. And here we have a man, very much like Margaret Thatcher in a way, who has this reputation for being a maverick man in charge when he is just bouncing on the strings of people who are really in charge. And it's time, surely, for the alternative media that pushed for Trump to look in the mirror and just say, we made a mistake here. And you know why they made a mistake? Because they believe still, or believed in this case, that people can become president with all the multi hundreds of millions of dollars in donations required to do that. That you can become president, despite all that, without being owned by those that provide the money. Oh my God, naivety. And I saw a video this week of clips from Alex Jones, the talk show host in America, who I think, you know, has put a lot of information out over the years that people needed to hear. You know, don't let's go black and white. Alex Jones is this, Alex Jones is that. You have to look at the totality and say, look, I think it was great that people had that access to that information, but this, well, no. And these clips were him comparing Trump to Netanyahu as the people fighting the globalists. Both are owned by the globalists. And in terms of Netanyahu, is an absolutely at the forefront globalist. If only Alex would look beyond the headlines and research the real background to all this and where it's coming from and more.